All right, so today's deep dive is going to be a little different.
Oh,
Yeah, usually we're digging into like circuits and code and data, all that good stuff.
right, right.
But a listener sent us something kind of unexpected, a true crime podcast episode.
Hmm. Interesting.
I know, right? So while it's not our usual tech territory,
Definitely not.
I'm still super curious to see, what kind of insights we can pull out of this together.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be a fun challenge to analyze a narrative like this instead of, our usual research papers or data sets.
Totally. So this episode is from a podcast called Serially. Have you listened to it?
I've heard of it, but haven't had a chance to dive in.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, they focus on like really intense true crime cases.
Okay.
And this particular episode dives into the case of Shane and Crystal Robertson from Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And they're accused of just like horrific child neglect and abuse. Just reading the summary sent chills down my spine.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's drawing a lot of comparisons to the Turpin case, another one of those House of Horror situations that just completely captivated the public.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's disturbing how those cases just grip everyone's attention. It makes you wonder, like, what is it about these cases that's so different from, your average child abuse case, right? Like, what makes them stand out in such a horrifying way?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Maybe it's the sheer scale of the neglect, the fact that something so monstrous could be happening, like right under everyone's noses. It's just baffling.
Totally. And it's not just like a theoretical concept. The episode really paints this vivid, and I mean vivid, picture of the Robertsons' home.
Yeah.
And it's just bleak.
Yeah.
We're talking feces, rotting food, exposed wiring, holes in the floor.
Ugh, it's hard to even imagine.
Sounds like something out of a nightmare.
Yeah.
Seriously.
It's a stark reminder that these House of Horrors, they're not just sensationalized stories. They represent a really horrifying reality for the victims involved. And in this case, it wasn't just the environment that was dangerous. There were 24 rats living alongside the 7 children.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that detail.
Yeah, so the neglect clearly extended to, like, both human and animal welfare, which is disturbing on multiple levels.
Absolutely. And it just makes you think, like, what was life actually like for those poor kids? Like the podcast host, Annie, she details how the kids were malnourished, had speech impediments, exhibited extreme social anxiety. It's clear they lacked education, socialization, like just basic care.
Right.
And then there's this chilling comment from Crystal Robertson where she actually referred to the children as garbage disposals with legs.
Ugh, that is just awful. That statement is so disturbing, because it shows a very deliberate attempt to dehumanize the victims. It's a classic abuser tactic shifting blame, minimizing the severity of their actions, and especially when you contrast that with the children's actual condition, the fact that they were so malnourished.
Exactly. And speaking of contradictions, this is where things get a little strange. The Robertsons claimed poverty, but somehow they managed to post a significant amount of bail. Like, that doesn't really add up, does it?
Not at all. It makes you wonder if there's an element of financial hoarding involved, which is something we often see in these types of abuse cases, unfortunately. Abusers might try to present this facade of poverty while simultaneously, like, controlling and withholding resources from their victims.
Wow, so they're basically manipulating the system.
Exactly. So it really begs the question, like, where did the money for bail come from if the children were starving?
That's the million-dollar question for sure. It's the perplexing detail that adds another layer to this, like, already complex and disturbing case.
It is, for sure.
And as if the neglect and the financial stuff weren't bad enough, the podcast then reveals the physical abuse the children endured.
I mean, this is where the case just takes a truly devastating turn, honestly. And, it's important for us to remember that we're talking about real children who suffered immensely at the hands of their caregivers. It's heartbreaking.
It is, and you're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the details of a case, but we can't forget about the real human cost.
Exactly.
So the podcast describes beatings with belts and cords, Shane encouraging one of his daughters to self-harm, and the mother was complicit in all of it, which is just...
Ugh, it's sickening. This escalation of violence, it's sadly a common pattern we see in domestic abuse situations. It often starts subtly and intensifies over time, and the psychological impact of that kind of treatment on children, it's just immeasurable.
Absolutely devastating. And then, to add another layer of complexity, there's the fact that this family moved around a lot. And apparently some of the charges against the Robertsons were actually dismissed because of jurisdictional issues.
Right, that's a common problem in these cases that span multiple states, you know? It can be really difficult to actually prosecute abusers when they're constantly moving. Creates a lot of confusion, complicates the legal process.
So like they're using the system to their advantage again.
In a way, yeah, it's a frustrating reality that can sometimes hinder justice from being served.
Before we move on to the next part of the episode, there's this one detail that I can't get out of my head. The podcast host, Annie, mentioned that Shane has a crystal tattoo on his neck. I know it might seem like a small thing, but it just stuck with me.
I mean, it's definitely an interesting detail. It could be a simple expression of love, you know? But it could also signify something more complex, like possessiveness, maybe even an attempt to deflect responsibility. It's hard to say for sure without more context, but it's definitely something investigators might consider when building a case against him.
Yeah, I mean, the symbolism there is just like too obvious to ignore. So to kind of recap where we are, Shane and Crystal are awaiting trial, and the children are, thankfully, recovering in foster care.
Okay, so at least there's a glimmer of hope in this otherwise, incredibly bleak situation.
Right. But it's important to remember that the road to recovery for these kids, it's going to be long and challenging. They're going to need so much support, therapy, just to start addressing all the trauma they've endured. And it just goes to show that the impact of abuse can truly last a lifetime.
It absolutely can.
So before we dive into the next part of the episode, I want to pause here and kind of pose a question to you, our listener. What stood out to you so far in this case? What detail or revelation has really hit you the hardest? Take a moment to just sit with that before we continue our deep dive into this incredibly complex and heartbreaking story.
It's a tough one to process, for sure. It really makes you think, like about the incredible resilience of the human spirit. That these children are even beginning to recover after experiencing such horrific abuse. It's just...
It is remarkable, and you're absolutely right. It's going to be a long and difficult journey for them.
Yeah.
And as we delve deeper into this serially episode, the story actually gets even more disturbing. Yeah, so after being released on bail, Shane and Crystal kind of just go about their lives as if nothing happened.
You're kidding.
I know. They attend their court appearances, but they remain totally silent about the accusations against them,
Oh, so they're not even trying to defend themselves.
Nope. Not a word. But then there's a twist.
Okay.
The authorities get new reports of physical abuse, which leads to forensic interviews with all 7 children.
Oh, God.
And it's through these interviews that the full extent of the horror they endured, it all comes to light.
I can only imagine what those poor kids went through.
It's gut-wrenching. They describe these horrific beatings with belts and cords, being punched, threatened, and one of the daughters even said that Shane encouraged her to self-harm.
That's just sick.
I know. And this detail, it's really got to me. Apparently, Shane wore the belt he used for the beatings every single day.
Oh, my God.
Like as this constant reminder of the threat of violence,
It's chilling. It's like he was intentionally creating this environment of, constant fear and intimidation.
Yeah, exactly. And it just makes those acts of physical violence that much more, calculated and deliberate.
Exactly.
Ugh. It's so hard to listen to these accounts without feeling this surge of, anger and sadness.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the daughters, she recounted how Shane held a blanket over her face, trying to suffocate her, and another said he gave her a knife and told her to stab herself.
Oh, my God.
It's just unimaginable cruelty.
It really is. And, those details are so incredibly disturbing, and they really just underscore the profound and lasting psychological damage that this kind of abuse, that it can inflict on children. We can't forget that abuse isn't just physical, right? It's emotional, it's verbal, it's psychological, and those scars, they run deep and they impact every aspect of a child's life.
Absolutely. And another thing that just really got to me was learning that these children were often forced to steal food because they were constantly hungry.
Oh, my God.
And when they got caught, they were beaten even more severely.
Oh, that just breaks my heart. It's just a horrifying cycle of abuse and deprivation.
It is. And, it just highlights that level of control and manipulation that we see so often in these abusive relationships. The Robertsons weren't just, passively neglecting their children. They were actively creating this environment of fear, deprivation, and just, intense suffering.
Right. They were deliberately making their children's lives a living hell.
Exactly. And, remember those speech impediments and the social anxiety the reporter mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It just makes you think about how isolated these children were from the outside world.
Right. They were completely cut off.
They were denied the most basic human needs, love, care, connection, all of it.
And those developmental delays, those are a direct consequence of their horrific upbringing, Children need proper care, education, and socialization in order to thrive. And without those fundamental elements, their development is just severely hindered. And unfortunately, the consequences can be lifelong.
It's just heartbreaking. And it's a stark reminder of how crucial early intervention is in these cases of abuse and neglect.
Couldn't agree more.
But, in this case, it really seems like the system failed these children on so many levels.
It does, yeah. It's really tough to say for sure, I guess, without knowing all the details of the investigation. But, these House of Horrors cases, they often raise questions about, were there any missed opportunities to intervene earlier, Like, were there any warning signs that were just overlooked or not acted upon quickly enough? And those are questions that, investigators will likely be exploring as this case continues.
Yeah, it makes you question the whole system, doesn't it? Like, how could something like this go on for so long?
It does. And it highlights just how important robust child protection systems really are.
What do you mean by that?
Well, systems that are properly funded, staffed with well-trained personnel, and empowered to act quickly and decisively when there's even a hint of abuse or neglect.
So it's not just about reacting to abuse after it's happened, but trying to be more proactive in preventing it altogether.
Exactly, yeah. Early intervention programs, parenting support groups, readily accessible mental health services, these can all make a world of difference.
Right. And it's not just about the authorities, right? We all have a role to play in protecting children.
Oh, absolutely.
We need to educate ourselves about the signs of abuse, be more aware of what's happening in our communities, and be willing to speak up when something doesn't seem right.
I completely agree. And we can't forget the importance of education, teaching children out healthy relationships, about boundaries, about how to seek help if they are being abused.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected.
And it's a complex issue, right? It's not a problem with any simple solutions. It requires a multifaceted approach addressing the issue on multiple levels. And while the Robertsons case is definitely extreme, it's a wake-up call for all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, compassionate, and absolutely committed to protecting the most vulnerable members of our society.
And, speaking of the case, there's some news that might sound positive at first, but it actually highlights a frustrating reality of these situations. Annie mentions that some of the charges against Shane and Crystal were actually dismissed due to jurisdictional issues.
Oh, wow. Really? So they're getting off on a technicality.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a common occurrence in cases that involve interstate crimes.
Right, because when abusers move frequently, it creates confusion, and you get those jurisdictional disputes that complicate the whole legal process, right?
Exactly, and it's like this loophole that allows them to kind of evade accountability for their actions.
And that is so incredibly frustrating, because it feels like the system is failing the victims yet again.
It does, and it underscores the need for greater coordination and communication between law enforcement agencies across state lines.
Absolutely, yeah. A more unified approach to handling these interstate crimes would go a long way in making sure that abusers don't just slip through the cracks because they move from one jurisdiction to another.
Right, they shouldn't be able to just escape justice by crossing state lines.
Exactly.
But thankfully, despite those dismissals, Shane and Crystal were eventually arrested again.
Oh, good.
And now they're facing a whole bunch of assault and abuse charges.
Okay, so they're finally being held accountable.
It seems like finally.
Yeah.
It sends a message that child abuse will not be tolerated, and that perpetrators will be brought to justice, even if the process is, super complex and challenging.
Absolutely. It's a small victory, but it's a significant one. And it hopefully gives some sense of, relief and validation to those children who have suffered so much.
I hope so. And Annie actually ends this part of the podcast by drawing some comparisons between the Robertsons case and other, infamous House of Horrors situations like the Turpin and Frater cases.
Right. And those cases, while they're definitely extreme, they highlight this disturbing trend that I think we need to pay attention to. Well, they force us to confront this uncomfortable reality that these horrific acts of abuse, they can happen anywhere, and they often go undetected for way too long.
It's terrifying.
It is. And it just makes you wonder, what are the systemic failures that allow these kinds of things to occur in the first place?
Right.
What can we be doing as a society to better protect those vulnerable children and actually prevent these tragedies from happening?
Big questions.
They are, but they're important ones that we need to be asking ourselves, you know? It's a conversation that needs to happen not just within the legal system, but also within our communities, within our families, you know? We need to be talking about this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it really takes a village to protect children.
It does, and I think this deep dive, as difficult as it's been, has really highlighted that.
Before we move on to the final part of this episode, I want to pause and just kind of pose a question to you, our listener. Why do you think cases like this keep happening? What are those societal blind spots, that allow such horrific abuse to occur undetected for so long?
Yeah.
Take a moment to really ponder that, and then we'll be back to wrap things up and share some final thoughts. It's frustrating, We talk about the warning signs, but cases like this, it's like, are we really doing enough?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that abuse thrives in secrecy, in isolation.
Right.
Abusers are often like master manipulators.
Oh, for sure.
They know how to coerce their victims into silence, and they can present this like charming facade to the outside world, It makes it incredibly difficult for anyone, even authorities or concerned individuals, to actually intervene.
Yeah, and Annie, the podcast host, she really hammers that point home.
Yeah.
She talks about how these House of Horrors stories make headlines because they're just so shocking and unbelievable.
Right, they seem almost impossible.
But the scary truth is that there are probably countless other cases happening right now that are just hidden.
Ugh, it's a chilling thought.
It is.
But it's probably true, and it really underscores the need for just greater awareness of the signs of abuse and neglect. And this isn't just about training professionals, it's about empowering communities to actually recognize and report potential abuse.
That's a good point.
It's neighbors, teachers, family members, everyone has a role to play in protecting children.
Totally. Like, it really does take a village.
It does.
But what about social services, though? Do you think there were, missed opportunities in the Robertson case, before it got this bad?
It's hard to say for sure without all the details.
Right.
But investigators will definitely be looking into that, It's possible there were warning signs that were missed or maybe not acted upon quickly enough. And, this case highlights the need for strong child protection systems.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking about systems that are well-funded, staffed with people who are trained really well, and, empowered to act swiftly when there's any suspicion of abuse or neglect.
So it's not just about reacting after the fact, but actually preventing it.
Exactly, early intervention programs, parenting support groups, mental health services that are easy to access. Those can all make a huge difference.
Right.
And, we can't forget about education too, right?
Like teaching kids about healthy relationships.
Yeah, teaching kids about healthy relationships, about boundaries, about how to seek help if they're being abused, All of that's crucial.
It's like this multi-pronged approach.
It is. It's definitely a complex issue.
Yeah.
And there are no simple solutions, It
Yeah.
requires us to address it on multiple levels. And while the Robertsons case is definitely extreme, it's a wake-up call,
It is, for sure.
It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, compassionate, and just completely committed to protecting those who are the most vulnerable in our society.
Well said. I mean, this whole deep dive it's been really heavy, but it's also been important.
It has, yeah.
And I think you made a good point earlier, storytelling can be a powerful tool to shed light on these issues and actually inspire action.
It can, and it can create change.
Exactly. I'm definitely feeling a little shaken by all this, but also more determined to, be a voice for those who can't speak for themselves,
I feel that.
It's a heavy responsibility, but I think we all share it.
We do.
And, there is hope. With the right support, with love and compassion, even the most traumatized children can heal and go on to thrive.
I absolutely believe that.
So to our listener, we'll leave you with this final thought. Justice may be served in the courtroom, but the real healing for those 7 children, it's going to be a lifelong journey. Let's all commit to doing our part to create a world where these stories, they become less and less common. A world where every child is safe, nurtured, and given the chance to reach their full potential.
And remember, even small acts of kindness and awareness can have a ripple effect. Never underestimate your power to make a difference in a child's life.